Welcome, everybody, to episode number 2 of our podcast on the book, The Coach and the Geek, with Mark Adams and Jeff Van Fleet. Welcome back, gentlemen, to our panel, and we look forward to this particular discussion on a very interesting topic. I always have told my intro to management students that if you're going to be a good manager, you have to clarify 3 things for those in your charge. Number 1 is what they do. Number 2 is how they're supposed to do it. And then number 3 is why. And we often get the what and the how done, and usually done very well. But there's not always so much of the development behind the question of why. And I think that's where real leadership comes in, differentiating itself from management. So that's what we're going to talk about on this episode. Mark, let's start with you, and then you can flip to Jeff with this first question. The difference between asking what versus how versus why. What kind of different answers will these questions give you?
Well, first of all, Ben, I wish I was in your class. I would have loved to have been in your class when I was at Cincinnati a really long time ago, because what you're exploring is so important to being successful as a leader. And to me, Ben, it really comes down to 2 differentiations between a how and what question versus a why question. How or what shows that you're interested. How are you doing? What are you doing? That shows interest. But why shows that you care. That's the difference right there. Now, that's not to say that it's never important or useful to understand how someone does something or what they are doing, but the real lessons learned are from the why. And the why always shows that a leader cares. It's like going down on the manufacturing floor, and you see someone that's going through, and maybe they're manufacturing vinyl lineals for windows. I used to be in that business. And certainly it was very interesting to understand how they were doing it and what they were doing it. But what I would ask them is, why is your job so important? Because I wanted them to see big picture of how they actually become a part of our culture of we, how they fit, if you will. And so the why question to me is always about caring, whereas the how and the what show only that you're interested.
And Jeff?
I really agree. I think when I think about the business perspective, I think as leaders, we have a job, especially in the what and especially in the why. So I think understanding and articulating expectations is the what. Here's what I need from you. Here's what I need you to accomplish. I try hard as a leader to not articulate how I want you to do it, but I try to define the guidelines of, I want you to deliver this on this date. Do you think you can do that? And if you do, great. The how is less important until we are trying to replicate that process. Then I want them to go build the process that defines the how, so we can do that time and time again and get consistent results. The why for me, when I was a young engineer, I grew up as a software developer. When I was a young engineer, most often my manager never told me why we were doing these things. And it's confusing, right? So for me today, I always start with the big picture of why, because I want all of us understanding the whole purpose of what we're doing here. Like, why are we in this? Why are we trying to do this? And the better that I can articulate that, and the better that they can get it, the more empowered they are to make freedom of choice in detailed decisions, where they don't have to come ask me a question because they understand the big picture. So for me, that why is really about the big picture. And there's a sort of a story of in sales and in leadership of asking the 5 whys. And it's not 5 different whys. It really is the same question 5 times, because the first time people are a little reticent to give you maybe the whole truth, and you're trying to dig a little deeper, and that second why opens the doors and gets you a little bit deeper, and the recipient of the question begins to trust you more, that you actually really care. And to Mark's point about carrying on the why, that's exactly what it is. And by the time you sort of imagine somebody asks you, well, why is that important to you? Then I think you really understand they really do care, because they're trying to understand it from your perspective with empathy.
Exactly. And one thing that I try to do is to impart to the students, robots are fine with what and how, but people have to have the why. At some point, they're going to rebel against you if you don't provide that for them. And, particularly, I think, gentlemen, in terms of lower level supervisors who have to oversee people who are doing some relatively menial tasks, and I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, but there are some things that are just rote, routine, have to do kinds of things. I think it's particularly important to bring them into the loop and make them feel important about the work that they do. For instance, if you're supervising a custodian staff, hey, we can't attract customers if our building's not clean. We can't have a safe and healthy work environment if our building's not clean. So giving those why answers to these questions are extremely important, I think. And that really, again, in my mind, is what differentiates a manager from a leader. So those are great perspectives from both of you. Jeff, we'll start with this second question in your answers and in hearing what you have to say about this. How do you know when you've spent enough time understanding the why before you move on?
When you're having that conversation about the why, what I try to do is have them explain it back to me. And so the better that they can do that. In fact, I'll say that to people sometimes. I was in a conversation with one of my employees yesterday, actually, and he was explaining why we're doing something. And after about 5 minutes, and I said, I got to tell you, I hear your words, but I can't go to the whiteboard and sort of draw it out yet. And I definitely couldn't teach it to somebody. So for me, when you got there, when the person you're talking to understands it well enough that they can explain it and teach it to somebody else. Ben, when you were just talking about how important it is to explain that to people, I was in a conversation earlier this year with an owner of a roofing company, and he bought this company. The company was doing fairly well, and all his employees are hourly. And what he began to notice was his profits weren't where he wanted them to be. And so he decided to do two critical things. He decided to create a profit sharing program with all of his employees. And he did that by explaining to them and educating them on how a profit and loss statement works. So he began teaching them financial principles. And as a result of that, the behavior that changed in his employees was, he said, we'd be up on a roof and there would be we'd have a case of caulking that would be caulking up whatever. And he said, it'd start to rain, the guys would run off the roof and not worry about that cardboard box that had filled with caulking. Well, after it gets wet, it's not useful anymore, but they didn't really care because they weren't bought in to the bigger picture. Now, he said, they are zipping along. They're making sure all the tools are clean. They're sharp. They're all protected. And the whole organization ran so much smoother because he began to share a little bit of the wealth with them and explaining the big picture of the why we do what we do with them. And I just thought, boy, just a great example of a leader.
Truly is. And Mark, before we flip to you and ask you that same question, we have a gentleman here in Springfield by the name of Jack Stack, who is probably the world's foremost authority on this thing called open book management, which is what you have basically just described. He took Springfield remanufacturing from an old International Harvester plant that was about to go belly up in the 1970s when there were no government bailouts and that sort of thing. It was going to throw hundreds and hundreds of people out of work here in Springfield, Missouri, and created a profit sharing type program and wrote the book, The Great Game of Business. And he's known for that all over the world and has produced several volumes, spun off a company, in fact, with that. And I think that's a brilliant strategy for any leader. Mark, as well, please chime in on how do you know when you've spent enough time on understanding the why before moving on?
Ben, I've got the wonderful opportunity of working with great, talented adults and some really talented and interesting fourth graders as a fourth grade basketball coach. And, old school coaching used to be, you tell people what to do and they do it. And don't ask any questions. You're going to do it my way or you're going to go the highway. I mean, that's right. Old school leadership, right? Old school coaching. But today, I've completely gotten against that model, and I might plead guilty on occasion to being that coach once upon a time. But today, I really work hard to engage, whether it be an audience, a coworker or a fourth grade basketball player on what are their lessons learned to get back to the why. Why do we pressure the ball? Why do we run motion offense with a basketball team of fourth graders? And when I asked them that question, Ben, I got responses back like, well, you want us to catch and square up with the ball. You want us to move. You know, if you always tell us, coach, if we're standing still, we're doing something wrong. Well, that's not the right answer. We run the motion offense because we want to score. That's the lessons learned. You know, and oftentimes we get so caught up in the minutia that we don't look beyond the minutia and then take time to understand lessons learned. What I've learned from Jeff and working with him at Lighthouse Technologies and working through this book together, there were always lessons learned. And so at the end of my fourth grade practice or in any business meeting, my role is to challenge everyone on our team. What did you learn today? What were the lessons learned? And that's when I know we've spent enough time on the why. When the why becomes answers of true lessons that you can apply to get better in life, as a professional, as a person, as a father, as a husband, that's when you know you've spent enough time on the why. But oh, by the way, once you even get to that point, there's going to be a lot more lessons down the road too, as you begin to expand across that why. And so why is a critical question, but only if you can take the time and have the discipline to get into your lessons learned mode to understand what everyone is getting from that experience of asking that why question.
Both of those are brilliant answers that remind me of a story that I once heard from a famous modern televangelist who learned this from probably one of the greatest evangelists of all time. And I could call the name, but I won't. This particular all-time great evangelist noted to some of his proteges in terms of developing leadership, in terms of the things that you tell your people. When you get sick and tired of saying something to them, and they get sick and tired of hearing you say something to them, they are just beginning to grasp it. And I think you both developed and amplified that same point with your answers in terms of this whole why question and the importance thereof, and probably a good little thing to file away for all of us in terms of the leadership and the why question processes that we have to go through. Final question for this episode. Mark, we'll start with you. How does asking and understanding why impact your team? Why is it so important to ask why? And to paraphrase the old commercials from about 10, 15 years ago, why ask why?
Well, I think it helps your team, every individual member, to understand their roles, to understand the importance of their role and how it fits within the context of the team and your organization as to why you do certain things. Because ultimately, why you do certain things, why you behave the way you do, that builds your culture. And if we want to build a culture of we, it comes down to understanding, not only understanding the importance of the expectations, but the importance of why we fit in and how our job is important, and what we do every day affects the long-term stability and ability to be successful within our team and our organization. So bottom line here, the importance of why is understanding your role, where you fit, and then also understanding what the expectations are, and then working as a team to fill your role to the best of your ability, and then to drive forward for those certain behaviors that are going to affect the positive outcome for your organization.
Role, expectation, teamwork. Those are great responses to that. Jeff?
What I would add to that a little bit is Mark talked about this idea of lessons learned. And just today, earlier today, Mark and I were having a conversation. We have a new employee who we asked to do something, and we spent a lot of time up front with them explaining why we wanted them to do it and what we wanted them to do. And frankly, talk to them about how they might go about doing it as well. And they were having difficulty. And so Mark repeated sort of the whole message, starting with, here's why we're doing this, here's what we're doing, and here's how we see you working. After about the third or fourth time, it didn't work out. Like they weren't getting it. And the first thing that he did is he calls me and he said, hey, I'm thinking maybe I didn't explain it to them well enough. Like maybe they just didn't get the why. And I think what I want you all to understand is this isn't like you do it once and it works smoothly and you're done. It doesn't work like that. You're constantly evaluating and um, checking in with yourself and checking in with your network, your peer network, to see, did I explain that well? Did I take the time? And I think it's hard, and I think it's a constant um, process that we go through, because it's important to us. The better that people can understand why they're doing things, the better they're going to be able to do their job and understand the big picture and the culture of a culture of we. And so for me, it's a lesson. It's about lessons learned and our lessons along the way.
Exactly. And success is often, Jeff, a moving set of goalposts. So, you do have to constantly be reinforcing the why as things evolve and change. Gentlemen, we thank you for your presence here on episode 2 of the podcast, The Coach and the Geek. Mark Adams of ESPN, Jeff Van Fleet of Lighthouse Technologies. Gentlemen, we will see you in episode 3 when we talk about winning versus success. Thank you for being with us.